one of the main reasons we invited you is because of your publication, Art and Nature in the Anthropocene, Planetary Aesthetics, which I thought was a nice add-on to it. And we talked about it the other day, the planetary aesthetics. What does that mean? And I'm not quite sure what you ended up making a choice on the presentation, but that's what's caught our eye. And in a way, it leads, whatever you want to say is going to lead on quite well from Nils, I feel. I think it's over to you now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. I should say that I'm a Pākehā, I'm a settler in New Zealand. So New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand is a bicultural country with three official languages, English, Māori, and New Zealand Sign Language. But more and more we do, it's a way of acknowledging place. As Neil said, place is incredibly important to what we do in our work when we're trying to think about the Anthropocene. So to acknowledge place here means that I say to you kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, which is just hello, and it's a great pleasure to be here. As Trevor said, my name is Susan Ballard, and I'm speaking to you tonight from Aotearoa, New Zealand, exactly 12 hours into your future. So when you are going to bed tonight, I will be getting up tomorrow morning. So thank you, Trevor, particularly for this invitation, which kind of came out of the blue, and this idea of the blue is quite important to what I'm doing in this work at the moment, thinking about what it means to be positioned on two small islands at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And in that positioning, how do I kind of look back? So this idea of looking back is quite critical to what I'll talk about in the next 20 minutes. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can look at some pictures instead of me. Okay. So, as I said, I'm based here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and part of what I'm really interested in is this question of the Anthropocene as viewed from what I think what you called was afar, the exotic afar. But of course, it's not afar for me. This is where I live. So I thought I'd talk you through some background to how I came to this concept of planetary aesthetics. And I'm an art historian, so I work with images. So I'm going to show you some pictures and talk about those pictures and talk about some of the context for those pictures. If my slides will change, there we go. So a while ago, I decided to start writing a book that would piece together the problems I saw with definitions of nature, particularly with those definitions as they sat within Western art history, within the discipline I'd been trained in. And so this was a problem within not just definitions of nature in the Anthropocene, but actually within my discipline itself. And the problem was with the usual ways of writing and talking about nature that I saw in our discussions of artworks. These seem to be fixed very narrowly in a way that meant that art histories were missing out art that was happening in 90% of the world outside of Europe and the US. And particularly due to climate change and our changing relationship with the planet, these were often sites in which these were quite critical and crucial experiences. So I wanted to think about how my discipline might address this. At the same time, I was starting to develop an undergraduate course that addressed these ideas with care. I was very cautious about the emotional toll that engaging with things like sea level rise might take on students who were experiencing the loss of their own land and their own place. So this material is very hard, and it's very hard to work with in a classroom. So I wanted to make sure that we felt safe in the classroom. So I thought about artworks that I felt should be in the canon of art history, works that might enable us to understand our planet in a new way. So the course is now called Art and Environment, and I'm about to teach it again starting in 3 weeks. And my goal with the course and now the book is to talk and think alongside a selection of artworks that move beyond or perhaps sidestep the expected ways of talking about nature and the changing planet in order to take us back into place, back into our place of connection. I also wanted to do this in a way that would feel different. I wanted to write art history and to teach art history in a way that reflected the artworks themselves. Sometimes I describe this as slipping into a kind of a lyric art history. You might call it poetic or even creative nonfiction. Could we slip into poetry as a way of approaching some of the trauma, some of the emotional toll of engaging with these very, very difficult environments and landscapes and stories? So the book that you mentioned, Art and Nature in the Anthropocene, takes this word Anthropocene literally and thinks about what it means for humans to be named geological, considers what it means for our geological impacts to be read in the rocks, water, and atmosphere of the planet, and wonders about the different ways that artworks might actually help us to understand and reflect on the planetary environment that we've created. So in Art and the Anthropocene, the artworks I talk about approach this idea of the planetary from the situated and from the local. So I'm really interested in this idea of the rubber boots method, because I think that's trying to do the same sorts of things, being located in place and then looking out. The artworks that I like to think with don't pretend to tell us how to act. They also don't tell us how to think. But instead, what they do is document the transforming world of humans, nature, and the planet. They tell a different story of the Anthropocene, one in which we might imagine a new planetary future. And I think if you wanted a definition of planetary aesthetics, it is that idea of imagining a new future for the planet through artworks. Many of these works perform and record complex histories, histories of colonization, histories of place, but they also record complex remembering, the way that planetary destruction has occurred, and they shape a lot of this through their own exhibition practices. So we see this visually, we might experience it visually. So these works for me help me imagine the present of the Anthropocene, because I think one of the problems that we've had for a while is that we've positioned the Anthropocene or climate change sometime in the future. And the artworks that I've been particularly interested in are ones that are saying, no, we've lived this, we're living this now. This is already experienced. So we've experienced the planetary, we've experienced these kinds of transformations. But as you all know, I'm sure artworks aren't only objects and artifacts, they also do labor, they do work. And I'm particularly interested in the work of art in this context. These artworks do much more than reflect current concerns. They tell stories of environmental, socioeconomic, and atmospheric transformation over time. They help us remember, they help us imagine, and in particular, they help us see what cannot be seen. So in my work, I've explored this world of the Anthropocene, or this world of the planetary, through the observation of visible things, artworks that other people have made, that to me suggest new ways to approach the concept of nature as part of the transforming planetary environment of the Anthropocene. And in particular, being here, this means to engage directly with the Anthropocene means turning our attention to gendered and racialized knowledge-making practices, the very practices that the idea of the Anthropocene has been built upon. So it's in this context that my work has developed across three central concerns. I've been thinking about how artists present new ways to understand planetary transformation. I've been thinking about how artists are talking about the relationship between human and non-human being, between living and extinction, between witnessing and turning away, thinking about the environment, colonization and capital together. And I've also been trying to think about how art contributes to, rather than simply reflects, our understanding of the world of non-art things, in particular the ongoing impacts of humans as a geological force. So to think differently and notice all of these bodies with which we share the planet and all of these relationships formed in more than human microspecies spaces, as we've just been hearing about, means shifting our aesthetic relationships as well. So my attention is on specific moments when artists construct new ways of seeing that challenge fixed concepts of nature and point to new ways of understanding the planet. For me, this is what art history does, and this takes me back to my initial question of how can I think about my discipline and how can I challenge my discipline? So art history to me is about looking at artworks again and proposing a new view. So I want to talk you through a couple of examples from the book itself. And this is how I begin my book. Once upon a time. Once upon a time, it sounds like a good way to start a story. Once upon a time, the planet was much cooler than it is today. Once upon a time, humans transformed the environment so much that it became necessary to say that we operated with a geological force. Once upon a time, we could talk about the weather, blue sky, and fresh air. Once upon a time, an artist filmed herself being buffeted by rising tides. Over 12 minutes and 11 seconds, the sun set and the tide rose. Softly at first, and gradually with more urgency, she worked to hold on to her land and stay safe. The light fades and she struggles to breathe. Her fingers grip at the edges of the platform, but there's very little to grasp. So in this work, Holding On, by Samoan-Australian artist Angela Tiatia, we see her lying on a concrete platform in the midst of the Pacific Ocean as she is buffeted by the rising tide. Like the islands of Tuvalu where the work was filmed, she is at the mercy of the rising seas. Tiatia's endurance points to the difficult relationship between humans and our changing planet. Holding On is a direct visual allegory. All at once, we sense the islands, the people, and the ecological crises that are being experienced here. All at once, we understand that the ocean that once gave life now has a different kind of relationship with the people who depend on it for life. The force of water can wash away bodies and rocks. Within the new contexts of the Anthropocene, the naming of humans as a geological force describes the way in which humans have manipulated and transformed the planet to an extent previously only attributable to earth systems or atua gods and other higher powers. And yet, as Tiatia shows, to be a geological force does not mean humans are solid or fixed. Here's another story from my book. Once upon a time, another artist arrived on an island seemingly inhabited only by birds. He began to paint them, giving them clothes, shoes, and fancy hats. Later, he returned to find the birds all stuffed. He found others splayed out in the kitchen of a well-meaning conservationist. He painted them again. This time, the painting hung like a shroud. How do we feel about our changing planet? In Tuvalu, the water table is now so high that drinking water must be sourced from rain. In times of drought, like in 2011, the island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean ran out of water. The sun is too hot and the soil too salty for crops to ripen. And this story is not unique to Moana Oceania, to the Pacific Ocean. Over the time of writing, the very worst imaginable disasters have occurred at both local and global scales. I've written alongside and amidst unprecedented floods, droughts, fires, tsunami, earthquakes, pandemic, and volcanic eruptions. It was always going to be this way because these are the ways that the planet lives and breathes. But something feels different this time. These events are catastrophic for all of us involved, for we are all involved at different scales and to different degrees. This crisis of anthropogenic climate change pervades every word that we write, the food that we eat, and the air that we breathe. Sometimes it's necessary to change scale. In 2009, Australian artist Mitchell Whitelaw fed weather data into a 3D printer and produced a bracelet. The bracelet is made from 1 year of temperature and rainfall data gathered in the city of Canberra over the 365 days between July 2008 and June 2009. Whitelaw traced daily maximum and minimum temperatures along with rainfall for the year. He describes the temperatures as simple hardline numbers by which we typically frame and interpret our experience of the weather. Part object and part functional visualization, the bracelet captures data made of daily experience that is not usually retained in our memory. It's kind of the opposite of the hyper-object that Niels was talking about earlier. We're concerned with what the weather might be today, but once today is over, we look to the weather tomorrow. Whitelaw gathers this rich data together and hands it to us as a personal object. The weekly aggregations of rainfall data are only small piercings, drops in the mountains of temperature. It's palpable how little rain there is. Tracing this elegant work back to Earth and social systems, it's possible to see how the material and energetic realities of weather systems contribute to the ways we might be able to understand ourselves as a geological force. In the same way that the Anthropocene entangles humans with geology, this data sculpture bracelet unpacks the thinking and making structures of Anthropocenic relationships, so that in thinking the planet or the planetary, we do so by thinking the human, nature, and the environment all together. So I start with my finger at the bottom of the world, and slowly spinning the globe, I find myself traveling north. I step off the sand, and under my fingertips is a blue-green foreverness. I spin and spin, trying to work out the exact opposite of here. If I travel straight up, I hit the coast of Alaska, and the thin strip of islands that make up Bristol Bay become my first sight of land. I start again, twisting rather than spinning the world this time. I head west, scoot across the Tasman and up the coast of Australia, then zigzag through Indonesia, India, and up through Iran and Turkey, finishing in Portugal. Here is my Antipodes, the exact opposite coast from here. And despite my watery tracing of the surfaces of the earth, if I think about the planet, I find it hard to forget the lingering image of a blue marble. My watery journey becomes replaced with an atmosphere of clouds, and a great swirl of blue and brown. In this context, why write about contemporary art? Art has always had a role in describing our relationship with the planet. As a discipline, art history describes carefully what it sees, connecting images to their social and cultural histories and ways of being in the world. But is description enough? Is metaphor enough? Are new forms of relationality and aesthetics enough? Do new words need to be invented? Should we look to figures of thought already present in the galleries and on pages that tell us our stories? So this returns me again to my challenge to art history, to myself, to my discipline. Art history helps us to observe subjects, objects, concepts, movements, thoughts, events, energies, and bodies are our objects of concern, even as they dematerialize before our eyes. We do this by telling stories of looking. In an age of catastrophic change that remains just out of our grasp, is this enough? If art history has a role to play, it is in describing and contextualizing this visual world as it appears right now. To do this involves operating in a world of affects and sensations, bringing together contemporary artistic practices with histories that enable us to experience the present in a way that is attuned to many potential futures. So, as I'm sure you know, the Pacific Ocean is the largest of the world's oceans. The thousands of islands scattered within its waters were settled thousands of years ago by diverse groups of people skilled at navigating complex oceanic currents. And yet, until the 18th century, Moana Oceania remained within the imaginary realm for Europeans. Rather than the unknown or the far away, this is a part of the world where people, plants, and animals sustain, live with, and traverse land and sea. As works like Lisa Rehana's show, it's not possible to think about global climate change without first considering the way that European concepts of nature fed into practices of colonization, capitalism, and dispossession. Even after the arrival of the European tall ships set on fixing everything in place, the Pacific remained a site of constant movement and encounter, trade, and exchange. So these works do not pretend to tell us how to act, but instead they document the transforming multi-species world of humans, nature, and the planet. They tell a story in which we might imagine a new planetary future. They imagine the present of the Anthropocene, as I've said, as we've already lived it and as it is experienced. So these are stories of love, loss, care, compassion, wonder, fury, and grief. And many are perhaps less fearful than the world feels at present. So I remain interested in the different ways that art counters the discourse of crisis and catastrophe by imagining, narrating, and anticipating the survival of the planet and its inhabitants within changing ecologies. This is not to deny that the climate in all senses is changing. These are artworks that are working to challenge the world as it is, at the same time that they imagine it otherwise. So this is a planetary aesthetics, a space where the impossible to believe has become a new kind of normal. And yet there have been enormous transformations in the way that humans respond. Large groups of people take to the streets and then stay home for extended periods of time. Habitual ways of being and living are changing. And despite the threats of politicians, children have a direct voice at the United Nations. Hope is fueled by hopelessness and grief, and we are hanging on. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, I think that develops a lot of channels actually. Let's take 5 minutes, although we're a bit over time. Let's please have a few responses and comments. That would be. So who's going to jump up and say, I want to say something? Shall I pick somebody out? So that's good. Who would like to say something in response, or develop some points, or questions, or do I have to do it? Come on. No, I don't need it. Yeah. Oh, it's good. Meaningful conversation.
Thank you, and thank you, Susan. As a trained artist and as an art critic myself, I'm really inspired by you talking and by you saying that you have to look at artworks in new ways and understand them and present a new gaze on art, especially. I find that, as Olaf Eliasson also is pointing to, that art in these days has a specific meaning and a specific task to build a bridge between ideas and science, because art can actually give a body and help us sense and understand very abstract thinkings. And it's very important to actually do both. We all have to learn new language. We have to educate ourselves. We have to read to science with the one hand, and we also have to have a practical practice, which is fundamentally engaged with nature and with materialism. So I see that your work is pointing to a specific, rather new field within visual arts, which is a new materialism, which I find very helpful myself to approach this totally new understanding of the world that we're living in. So for me, your voice is resonating very deeply. So I would like to thank you a lot for that. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the things I was thinking about when I began this work was about the fact that when European, we'll call them explorers, started to imagine the Pacific, they were imagining, right? This was a form of imagination. This was a form of trying to know or not know what they might experience and what they might see. And I think some of what you say is really important about how we might possibly bring art and science maybe closer together to bridge them, because I think actually both art and science are about imagination. They're about imagining what we don't know. And if we're dealing with climate change, whatever form of it, whatever way it manifests, we need to imagine other ways of engaging with it and other forms of connection. So I think that, yeah, thank you so much for your response. But I really like your way of thinking that art is about also bridging things, about, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Christina Fence.
Thank you, Secret Hotel and Earthwise Residency. Thank you, Susan. And also thanks to Indonesia, to Nils, whose work I've followed as a friend of Aura. Yeah, and commenting also on Trina's comment. I just want to see if I can put two comments together, because I think the Anthropocene, the way that Nils talks about it, is interesting. It gives new aspects, but at the same time, I guess most of us here today want to move into a new epoch where man is not dominating so much, but we could talk of symbiocene or Planetropocene. But of course, we need to understand what the beep we're in order to navigate the dark times that we're in. And there is exactly art is important, because of opening up for fantasy, for imagination, for all these elements of human abilities that has not been an important part of industrialized extraction time. And as I will elaborate on in my workshop today, also the word nature just keeps it in the Western illness of being divided from our home, from the planet, from the soil, from the land. And that's where art is amazing, because it's endless, it's borderless, and it has the space for spirituality as well, for acknowledging that we're not alone on this planet. And that's so beautiful with Australian and New Zealand work, that how you are culturally taking in the history of the pre-colonial times, acknowledging other worldviews. Because the worldview where spirituality is present, where spirits are present, that's for me where we can navigate better to see the world as alive instead of something we can use.
Thank you.
I like your idea of nature as a Western illness, which is what I heard. I hope that's what you said. I think it's really fantastic. It's a great way of thinking through the definition of that word. I think, as all parts of the world, all human parts of the world are dealing with colonization, whether or not you are an environment that was colonized or you were a colonizer. I think we all have to work with that and its collection to capital, and capitalism is our biggest challenge. And I think it's in some of those spaces where art really starts to push us and challenge us. I just thank you again for your comments. I think it's really interesting.